and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
The Willie Horton case was not only a brutal tale of murder, but also an intense bargaining chip used amongst political opponents of the 1988 presidential election to further their own agenda and win over the public's support. Such use of the case was implemented in biased campaign ads designed to attack opponents and gain popular support. On October 26, 1974, in Lawrence, Massachusetts, Willie Horton and two accomplices robbed Joseph Fournier, a 17-year-old gas station attendant, and then fatally stabbed him 19 times after he had cooperated by handing over all of the money in the cash register. His body was dumped in a trash can. Fournier died from blood loss. Horton was convicted of murder, sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and incarcerated at the Northeastern Correctional Center in Massachusetts. The New York Times article, "Expressive Justice is All the Rage," from 1995 centered around the controversial account that inspired a political storm. His ghost haunted American politics during the 1988 presidential election as Republican candidates sought to make Democratic opponents look soft on crime. Republicans used his story to beat up on the Democratic governor Michael Dukakis in the 1988 campaign, igniting a national controversy over negative advertising and racism. Why won't Willie Horton go away? In part because the controversy remains unsolved. In hindsight, however, it's apparent that Horton also stands for something far more specific than political tactics and taboos. 5 elements define a Willie Horton crime. It is violent, involving homicide, rape, or a bloody assault. The victim is white and middle class. The victim is innocent. The victim is chosen at random, and the criminal has a record suggesting that the crime might not have happened had the criminal justice system worked right. Crimes that include at least 4 of these elements arouse the press and the public. Despite the statistics that state otherwise, these proclaimed Willie Horton crimes are only a tiny percentage of all crimes, and the American public was led to believe they were much more prevalent by politicians using the media to instigate fear and gain support. Catherine Beckett points out in her book, The Politics of Injustice, that one of the most noteworthy characteristics of contemporary crime news has been its tendency to focus on the rarest types of crime, such as murder and robbery. According to one study, although they comprise less than 0.2% of arrests, murders account for between 27% and 29% of all crimes on the evening news.
As Governor Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers, he vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. While out, many committed other crimes like kidnapping and rape, and many are still at large. Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts. America can't afford that risk.
The Bush campaign ran another commercial which showed a bleak prison scene with prisoners exiting a revolving door. That image was accompanied by a false script that 268 first-degree murderers had breached furlough under Dukakis and had reoffended by committing kidnapping, rape, or murder. Despite political claims of the 268 furlough escapees, Horton was the only person who committed a crime. The rest returned no more than 4 hours late, yet this fact was excluded from Bush's arguments. The furlough program, ironically, was a Republican initiative established by Dukakis' predecessor in 1972. Then Bush, the Republican candidate, used it against Dukakis. On June 6, 1986, convicted murderer Willie Horton was released from the Northeastern Correctional Center in Concord. Under state law, he had become eligible for an unguarded 48-hour furlough. He never came back. Horton showed up in Oxon Hill, Maryland on April 3, 1987. Clifford Barnes, 28, heard footsteps in his house and thought his fiancée had returned early from a wedding party. Suddenly, Willie Horton stepped out of the shadows with a gun, and for the next 7 hours, Horton punched, pistol-whipped, and kicked Barnes, and also cut him 22 times across his midsection. When Barnes' fiancée returned that evening, Horton gagged her and savagely raped her twice. Horton then stole Barnes' car and was later chased by police until he was captured. The emotive impact of the Horton commercial when linked to the image of the revolving door was overwhelming. Here is a video of journalist Barbara Walsh, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her series about the Massachusetts prison system.
So we learn in March of '87 that Willie Horton had escaped, and we're thinking, how does a first-degree killer escape? He's in a secure prison. We learn Willie Horton was on a furlough, an unsupervised weekend pass. He won a $1,000 lottery ticket, decided, I'm facing life in prison. I'm not going back. Went to Florida, eventually went to Maryland, where he raped, he held a couple hostage, raped the woman twice, stabbed the fiancé. So it began a year-long investigation that I was on as a reporter. What are these furloughs? Killers and rapists were coming out on the weekend. And we learned during that process, I called every state in the country because Massachusetts said, oh, everyone does this. I learned after talking to every state, Massachusetts was the only state letting killers and rapists out unsupervised on the weekends. Most states, like when I called Louisiana and said, do you let killers and rapists out on the weekend? They said, no, ma'am, we hang them. Massachusetts had done this so prisoners would be good in prison during the week. So it outraged people, and eventually George Bush Sr., his people were calling our newsroom. They used the story on the national presidential debate against Michael Dukakis.
In the U.S., the home of negative political advertising in the land of scientific research, to prove the obvious, studies have shown that negative information is processed at a deeper level than positive information. In other words, politicians use negative advertising because it works. In Catherine Beckett's book, The Politics of Injustice, she illustrates several arguments about the role of politicians and officials as news sources. In general, journalists prefer politicians and government bureaucrats as news sources. Officials are often seen as authoritative and thus lend legitimacy to the often ambiguous journalistic enterprise. She goes on to say, officials are also able to supply journalists with a steady diet of appropriately formatted and timely information, a necessity in the deadline-driven world of modern journalism. This method of negative advertising and slander has continued in today's political world. History has illustrated the effect of such campaigning and its effect on the public, as clearly demonstrated in the 1988 election and similarly in an election 20 years later. The following is an anti-Obama ad created by the same person who made the anti-Dukakis ads from the 1988 election.
Tamika McFadden Harris, murdered leaving church choir practice. Cut down by gang gunfire while shielding her 6-year-old daughter. Mike Boyd, killed at 15, beaten with bricks after a gang member crashed into his car. Severo Enriquez, just 14 years old, when he refused to flash a gang hand sign, he was shot 5 times in the back. They all died in 2001. In Chicago, the Sun-Times called it urban terrorism and demanded action on gang violence. But that same year, a Chicago state senator named Barack Obama voted against expanding the death penalty for gang-related murders. When the time came to get tough, Obama chose to be weak. So the question is, can a man so weak in the war on gangs be trusted in the war on terror?